Today, we're going to explore 3 chilling true crime cases involving serial offenders. Let's begin with the first case. In 16 months, 22 women lost their lives across 2 countries. All of them were found in vacant rooms of their own homes. All of them had simply placed a room for rent sign in their window. The man who came knocking was polite. He carried a Bible. He spoke quietly and smiled at the door. Police in a dozen cities had no idea they were all chasing the same person. By the time they finally connected the dots, the number of cases had already crossed an international border. This is how it unfolded, and how one of the most dangerous offenders North America had ever seen managed to stay invisible for so long. February 20th, 1926, San Francisco, California. Clara Newman was 60 years old. She ran several boarding houses across San Francisco and was known as a careful, no-nonsense landlady. She did not rent to drinking men or sailors. When she placed a room for rent sign in the window of her Pierce Street home, she was simply looking for a good, reliable tenant. The man who showed up at her front door was well-dressed, polite, and quiet. He tipped his hat. He spoke in a soft voice. Clara was satisfied with what she saw and let him inside without a second thought about who she was letting in. That same morning, her nephew Merton Newman was upstairs in his second-floor apartment. He walked down to the kitchen and found the stove still on, with food abandoned on it. In the hallway, he ran into a large, dark-complexioned man with his hat pulled low, walking toward the front door. The man told Merton to let the landlady know he would be back in an hour to take the room. Then he turned and walked out without waiting for an answer. Several hours later, with Clara nowhere to be found, the boarders of the house searched every room. They found Clara Newman in a vacant upper apartment. She was found dead. Investigators noted additional disturbing evidence at the scene. Police had very little to work with. One brief description of a large, dark-complexioned man. No name, no clear lead, and no idea they had just counted their first case. Laura Beale was 63 years old. Her husband came home from work one afternoon and could not find her anywhere. A careful search of the house eventually led to a vacant apartment on an upper floor. She had been taken from this world in similar disturbing circumstances. The press quickly linked the 2 cases and began warning the public about a mysterious dark stranger moving through the Bay Area. Tips poured into police stations from across the region. None of them led anywhere useful. The story eventually dropped off the front pages. People assumed the man had moved on to somewhere far away. He had not moved on at all. He had simply moved to a different street. By June 1926, the man had found his way into the San Francisco home of Lillian St. Mary, a widow who had recently started renting rooms to bring in extra money. He told her he had just arrived in the city and was saving to get married. She showed him a vacant second-floor apartment and walked inside ahead of him to describe the room. Once she entered the room, he attacked. A boarder coming up the stairs minutes later found the apartment door standing open, and Lillian was found dead in her room. She had made no sound loud enough for anyone to hear. 2 months later, in August, Mary Nisbet, 50 years old, disappeared from her Oakland boarding house. Her husband Stephen came home from work to find dinner half prepared on the stove and his wife gone. He searched the house with neighbors and eventually found Mary in the second-floor bathroom. She was found dead in the bathroom. Investigators described the case as especially disturbing. Investigators held her husband briefly as a suspect. By the time they cleared him and understood what they were dealing with, the man they were looking for was already several states away. Portland saw 3 women taken from this world in just 3 days. Beata Withers, a divorced woman in her mid-30s who ran a boarding house, was found inside a trunk in the attic of her own home. Virginia Grant was found hidden behind a furnace in a vacant property. Mabel Fluke was discovered in an attic crawl space. Something had clearly changed. For the first time, the offender was making a deliberate effort to conceal the remains rather than leaving them where they were. Portland police issued public warnings. Local newspapers told women never to show a vacant room to a male stranger on their own. People listened and took it seriously, but only for a while. Caution fades with time, and that is exactly what he counted on every single time. The pace of the crimes did not slow down. He moved through Los Angeles, then up to Seattle, then eastward through Iowa and Kansas City. In Philadelphia, a 60-year-old woman lost her life. Then Buffalo, New York. Then Detroit, Michigan, where on June 1st, 1927, 2 women in the same building were taken from this world within just a few hours of each other. Investigators recovered evidence of a distinctive method. The physical evidence at the scene matched the pattern investigators were tracking, a detail that investigators noted carefully, knowing it could help identify the person responsible. Police departments across multiple states were now exchanging messages and comparing crime details. The pattern was far too consistent across too many cities to be a coincidence. But the man moved faster than anyone could communicate. By the time a description arrived in one city, he had already been and gone from another. 20 women across more than a dozen American cities had lost their lives. And then he crossed the border into Canada, the decision that would finally prove to be his last mistake. He crossed from Minnesota into Manitoba in the first week of June 1927. His first stop in Winnipeg was a second-hand clothing store on a downtown street, where he traded in his clothes for a plain worker's outfit and walked away with $1 in change. He then made his way to Catherine Hill's boarding house on Smith Street, a quiet residential neighborhood near the center of the city. He told her his name was Mr. Woodcoats. He paid $1 and promised 3 more by Friday. Catherine Hill described him to police later as a pleasant, quiet Christian man who gave her no reason for concern. On the afternoon of June 9th, 1927, 14-year-old Lola Cowan was walking through the Smith Street neighborhood, selling handmade paper flowers door to door. Her father was ill, and her family was struggling badly to make ends meet. Lola was doing whatever she could to help bring in money for the household. Nobody saw her encounter with the man on Smith Street that afternoon. Nobody knew she had gone to his room. Days later, police recovered Lola Cowan in his room, and the scene deeply affected responding officers. Officers stepped out into the hallway, unable to continue. Lola Cowan, who was 14 years old, became one of the youngest victims in the case. The following afternoon, he noticed a room for rent sign outside the home of William and Emily Patterson on a nearby street. Emily was inside on her own, cleaning the house. He knocked and offered to do some small repairs in exchange for a lower weekly rate. Neighbors on the street watched him fix a broken screen door that afternoon. He seemed completely ordinary, calm, polite, and unhurried. Once he knew Emily was alone, he carried out the crime. Emily Patterson was 31 years old. She left behind a husband named William and 2 young boys. That same evening, William Patterson came home to a quiet, empty house. He called out for Emily. No answer. He asked the neighbors. Nobody had seen her since the afternoon. At 11:30 that night, kneeling beside his bed to pray, he stood up and accidentally lifted the edge of the bedspread with his knee. He looked under the bed and realized Emily had been dead. He already knew before he saw anything else. The city was in shock. 2 women gone in 2 days. Police wasted no time and began sweeping every boarding house in Winnipeg, assuming the American traveling offender had crossed the border. Catherine Hill quickly picked Mr. Woodcoats out of a police lineup without hesitation. Witnesses from a clothing store, a barber shop, and a city tram all gave the same description: a stocky, dark-complexioned man with fresh, deep scratches on his face. The description was sent out to every town near the Manitoba border. A reward of $1,500 was announced for information leading to an arrest. For the first time in over a year, police had a real trail to follow. The man made several mistakes in Canada he would not have made at home. He kept calling local farms ranches, a word people in that part of Canada simply do not use. The people he said it to found it odd and remembered it well. When news of the Winnipeg crimes reached them, they reported straight to police. Officers traced his path and worked out which direction he was heading next. A local constable in the small town of Killarney, Manitoba, spotted a man matching the description and stopped him. The man said his name was Virgil Wilson, a working man just passing through. He was polite and completely relaxed, so relaxed that the constable was not fully convinced he had the right person. He brought him to the local jail as a precaution anyway. His shoes, socks, and belt were removed as standard procedure, and the cell was locked behind him. That night, Virgil Wilson was gone. He had found a small piece of wire inside the cell, worked the double lock open, and slipped out into the dark without making a sound. He spent the rest of the night hiding in an old barn outside of town. In the morning, he found a discarded pair of hockey skates, pulled the blades off, and tied them to his bare feet as makeshift shoes. He began walking south toward the American border. He stopped a farmer along the road to ask for a cigarette and stood there talking. No proper shoes, a ragged sweater, hockey skate bottoms on his feet, as though nothing at all was wrong. The farmer grew suspicious after the man moved on and went straight to the constable. Police caught up with him less than a mile down the road. He was taken to Winnipeg and placed in a secure cell at the Rupert Street police station. There were no more escapes after that. The net had finally closed. In his first week in custody, more than 40 people from across 2 countries viewed him in lineups or identified him from photographs. Almost all of them placed him at or near crime scenes. San Francisco police sent fingerprints from his earlier criminal record. They matched prints lifted from multiple crime scenes across several American states. The knife found in his possession had the exact burn marks on the blade that Detroit investigators had predicted and described months earlier. His wife confirmed she had not seen him at home during any of the periods when the crimes took place. He was formally connected to 22 offences, the first on February 20th, 1926, and the last on June 10th, 1927. Faced with all of this, he denied everything. He told a reporter from a Manitoba newspaper, "Such a crime is impossible for a man of my high Christian ideals." The trial became the biggest news event Manitoba had seen in many years. Every seat in the courtroom was taken from the first day to the last. Witnesses placed him at crime after crime with calm, consistent testimony. The families of those who were affected spoke in court, and the gallery sat in near silence throughout. The defense put forward an insanity argument. His wife testified about the strange behavior she had seen during their marriage, the constant unexplained clothing changes, the religious visions he described during his hospital stays, the uncontrollable jealousy. His aunt described years of deep fear and sudden violent episodes. Both women were clearly trying to protect someone they loved, and everyone in the room understood that. The prosecution called a psychiatrist to the stand. The doctor agreed the man had a deeply disordered mind, but he stated plainly that the man understood what he was doing and knew the difference between right and wrong. Under Manitoba law, that was the only point that mattered for the insanity argument. The defense failed completely, and the case was now in the hands of the jury. The jury took less than an hour. Guilty. Judge Andrew Dysart sentenced him to capital punishment. He stood in the dock and looked at the judge with no expression, no fear, no emotion, no sign that any of it had reached him at all. He appealed to the High Court of Manitoba. The appeal was dismissed. The day before his execution, he met with the families of 2 individuals, including the mother of Lola Cowan. He sat through the entire meeting and still refused to admit to anything. On January 13th, 1928, he was taken to the place where the sentence would be carried out at Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg. He was 30 years old, and he had been on the run for nearly 2 years. The prison official asked for his final words. He looked out at the witnesses and said, "I forgive those who have wronged me. No confession, no acknowledgement, no apology whatsoever for 22 lives ended." The sentence was carried out. The procedure was later described as mishandled. The procedure did not end quickly. Official records documented the cause of death, echoed the pattern the investigators had identified earlier. Now that the full account of the crimes has been told, the question that remains is, who was this man and what made him this way? His name was Earl Leonard Nelson. He was born on May 12, 1897, in San Francisco, California. Both his parents died from syphilis before he turned 2 years old. He was raised by his grandmother, Jenny Nelson, a strict and deeply religious woman who ran a cold, rigid household, guided entirely by the Bible. From his earliest years, Earl was a difficult and unusual child. He spoke to people who were not there. He left home in clean clothes and returned wearing dirty rags that belonged to strangers. He stole small items for no clear reason. He was removed from school at age 7 for frightening his teachers and the other children. Around age 10, he was struck by a streetcar while riding his bicycle and suffered a serious head wound. He was unconscious for nearly a week. When he recovered, people around him noticed changes. His headaches were constant. His moods were harder to predict. His grip on everyday life seemed weaker than before. As a young man, he moved between petty crime and failed attempts at steady work. At 18, he was sent to San Quentin prison for breaking into a cabin. After release, he enlisted in the army and deserted. He joined the Navy and deserted again. He tried a third military role and deserted a third time. By 1918, the Navy had him committed to Napa State Hospital for the mentally ill. He was 18 years old. Doctors at Napa recorded hallucinations, a heavy fixation on religion, and a powerful urge to escape confinement. He broke out twice and was brought back both times. The third time he escaped in 1919, the hospital stopped chasing him. They wrote "improved" in his file and closed the case. They also wrote that he was not violent and not dangerous to other people. Both of those statements turned out to be wrong. After release, he found work as a janitor and married a woman named Mary Martin, who was 58 years old. The marriage fell apart quickly. Earl was controlling, unpredictable, and frightening to be around. When Mary refused to take him back after he walked out, he lost what little stability he had. On May 19, 1921, he posed as a plumber. and got inside a home on Pacific Avenue in San Francisco. He found 12-year-old Mary Summers alone in the basement and attacked her, and her cries for help brought her brother running. Earl escaped but was caught within 2 hours. A judge sent him back to Napa with a written order stating he was dangerous to be at large. He escaped from Napa again in late 1923, was caught 2 days later, and was held there until May 1925. When they released him once more with those same 3 words, "Discharged has improved." 10 months later, Clara Newman opened her front door on Pierce Street, and the counting began. In just over a year, 22 women would lose their lives. Earl Leonard Nelson is now recognized as one of the first documented serial offenders in North American history. His crimes spanned multiple states and crossed an international border at a time when police agencies had no shared system for tracking patterns across different cities or countries. His case contributed to later discussions about how law enforcement must communicate across borders and how the mental health system needs to take more responsibility before releasing dangerous individuals back to the public. Napa State Hospital had written records of his violence, his delusions, and the risk he posed. They released him twice anyway. Each time they wrote, improved, and moved on. Every warning was on paper. None of it was acted on. The 22 confirmed individuals, Clara Newman, Laura Beale, Lillian St. Mary, Mary Nisbet, Beata Withers, Virginia Grant, Mabel Fluke, Blanche Myers, Lola Cowan, Emily Patterson, and others across California, Oregon, Washington, Iowa, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan, were ordinary women living quiet lives. Most were alone. Most were simply trying to earn a little extra money by renting out a spare room. They opened their front doors to someone who appeared completely safe. That one moment of trust cost every single one of them their lives. The most dangerous people do not look dangerous. They arrive politely, with a calm face and a simple story. Share this video so more people understand how cases like this happen and what warning signs were missed along the way. Subscribe for more true crime stories told with care and respect for the people at the center of them. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and look out for the people in your life. Now, let's move on to the second disturbing true crime story. On a hot afternoon in August 1973, a detective broke the lock on a storage shed in South Houston, pulled the door open, and the scene immediately felt wrong. Pause. A teenager standing behind him had led him there and told him what was inside, and the detective had not fully believed him until that moment. What they found when they started digging changed the entire understanding of what had been happening in one Houston neighborhood for the previous 3 years. 27 young men, all from the same community, most of them known to each other, and the man responsible had been attending their neighbors' Easter dinners the whole time. This is the story of Dean Call. Houston in the early 1970s was a booming industrial city, and within it, there was a working-class neighborhood on the northwest side called the Heights, where families scraped by on modest incomes. Both parents worked long hours, and teenagers moved through the streets with a great deal of freedom and very little oversight, which was simply the way things were in that era and in that place, and nobody thought of it as a vulnerability because nothing had yet happened to make them think of it that way. At the time, Houston police lacked a missing persons unit. Teen cases were handled by juveniles, separate from major case investigators, with little coordination. Parents were routinely told boys would return. From 1971 to 1973, 40 to 50 young people vanished from Heights alone. but cases stalled as no one connected the pattern or reviewed files collectively. Dean Arnold Call was born on Christmas Eve of 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and grew up in a household shaped by a cold and resentful father, while his mother Mary worked to protect him and compensate for what their father withheld. And when they divorced in 1942, the family began moving around until they landed in Vidor, Texas, where Mary remarried and where she and her new husband opened a small candy manufacturing operation that Dean worked in whenever he was not in school. Dean was a quiet and withdrawn child who made almost no friends, and when he was 7 years old, he developed a fever-related illness that went undiagnosed for 4 years and left him with a lasting heart condition and unable to participate in physical education, which pushed him further outside the social life that other children his age were building. In 1958, the family relocated to Houston's Heights neighborhood and opened a candy shop positioned directly across the street from an elementary school. And this is where everything that came later began to take shape, because Dean discovered that children and teenagers responded to him in a way that adults never had, and that he had a natural ease around young people that made them trust him quickly and completely. He set up a pool table in the back room and let kids come in after school to hang out, and he gave away candy freely and helped neighbors fix their cars and showed up when people needed something done and never asked for anything in return. And the community came to see him as one of those genuinely good people who make a neighborhood feel like a real community. The nickname the Candyman settled on him naturally and followed him from the Heights to every apartment he lived in afterward, and nobody around him had any reason to question it. When the candy shop closed in 1968 and his mother moved to Colorado, Dean stayed behind in Houston and took a job as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company, and moved into his own apartment with no family nearby and no structure imposed from outside. One of the first young people he drew into his orbit was a boy named David Brooks, who had been visiting the shop since he was about 12 years old and who was regularly made fun of by other kids. And Dean treated him with respect and gave him money and let him ride his motorcycle and made him feel valued in a way no one else had managed. So David came to see Dean as something like the father he had never really had. When David arrived at the apartment one evening without warning and walked in on a scene that made the nature of Dean's activities completely clear, Dean responded by offering him money and gifts to stay quiet and to help, promising $200 for every young man David could bring over by presenting it as a casual social invitation. And David accepted because Dean was the most important person in his life and because the alternative to cooperation was made quietly. In late 1971, David introduced Dean to a 15-year-old named Elmer Wayne Henley, who had grown up with an abusive father and had dropped out of school to help support his mother. And when Wayne met Dean, he later described the experience as meeting the most capable and present adult he had ever spent real time with. Someone who listened to him and came over to fix his mother's car and sat at the Easter dinner table and charmed the whole family effortlessly. Dean told Wayne he was connected to an organization in California that worked with young men, framing the whole arrangement in terms that made it sound like a business opportunity. And he offered Wayne the same financial deal he had given David, and Wayne accepted partly because the money was real, and partly because Dean made it very clear that Wayne's younger brothers would not be protected if Wayne ever stopped being useful. Together, the three of them became a system that operated across 1971, 1972, and into 1973, with Wayne and David bringing boys from the Heights to wherever Dean was living under the pretense of a social invitation. And once inside, Dean would present a routine involving restraints device as a game and demonstrate how to escape while secretly keeping a key. And once the other person was restrained and unable to leave, the situation shifted entirely, and there was no way out for them. While all of this was happening, parents in the Heights were doing exactly what parents are supposed to do when a child disappears, and they were met at every turn with the same response, that teenage boys were known to run away and that their sons would probably turn up eventually. Dorothy Hillergeist refused to accept that explanation because her 13-year-old son David had vanished on May 29th of 1971 while heading to the local swimming pool, and David had above-average grades and a happy home life and a family vacation planned for the following day that he had been genuinely excited about, and his clothes and his spending money for the trip were still exactly where he had left them in his room. Dorothy and her husband spent months searching the city and hired a private detective and printed 500 posters offering a $1,000 reward for information, and a teenager named Wayne Henley helped them put the posters up around the Heights, which is one of the details that becomes harder to absorb the more you understand what Wayne actually knew about what had happened to David. A woman in the neighborhood noticed a car she did not recognize moving slowly through the streets and watching the children outside, and she wrote down the license plate and took it to the police department, and that plate belonged to a vehicle connected to Dean Call, and the police did not follow up on it. The father of two brothers who went missing, a man named Everett Waldrop, went to the police station so consistently over such a long period that he later said he had been there about as often as the chief himself, and he specifically told investigators that he had heard a rumor about a man hiding victims at a local storage facility, and police went and looked briefly and determined it was not credible and closed the matter. Both of Everett's sons were found in that storage facility. By the summer of 1973, Dean had become noticeably less stable, and Wayne later described him as growing agitated and restless when too much time passed between incidents, and the pace of what was happening accelerated significantly between June and August, as Dean acted with less patience and less caution than he had shown before. And Wayne had tried to create distance by attempting to join the Navy, but had been rejected because he lacked a high school diploma and felt completely unable to leave because of the threat Dean held over his younger brothers. On the night of August 7th, going into the early morning of August 8th, Wayne brought two friends to Dean's house in Pasadena, a girl named Rhonda Williams and a 19-year-old named Tim Curley. And Dean was unhappy about the girl because he had told Wayne never to bring one, but allowed the evening to proceed, and all three teenagers eventually lost consciousness. And when Wayne came back to awareness, he was on the floor with his hands restrained, and Rhonda and Tim were already restrained nearby, and Dean was moving around the room armed, and clearly intending to follow through on whatever he had planned for the night. Wayne kept himself calm and told Dean he would cooperate, but needed his hands free to be useful, and Dean released him, and the moment Wayne's hands were free, he reached for the weapon and picked it up and raised it and told Dean it was over. And Dean walked toward him and said with complete confidence that Wayne would not go through with it. And Wayne kept using weapon because Dean kept coming, and he kept firing until Dean finally went down in the hallway and collapsed in the hallway. Wayne freed Rhonda and Tim. The three of them walked outside and sat on the curb in the early morning light, and Wayne picked up the phone and called the police and gave them the address and waited for them to arrive. Wayne had names to support what he was saying, names that matched actual missing persons reports on file, so that afternoon, Mulliken drove Wayne to the Southwest Boat Storage Facility in South Houston, and Wayne pointed to stall number 11, and the name on the rental contract was Dean Call. And when they got the door open and Wayne's face went pale, Mulliken understood that the boy had been telling the truth about everything. Inside the stall, the ground had been disturbed in multiple places, and there were sacks of lime stacked against the walls, and they brought in shovels and started working through the floor systematically. And the first individual was found about 6 inches down, concealed carefully. And then there was another, and then more beneath that. And by midnight on August 8th, 8 remains had been removed, and the search was not finished. The next morning, Wayne led investigators to a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn, about 150 miles north of Houston, where 4 more were found. And the day after that, he and David Brooks, who had walked into Houston death investigation with his father and given a full written statement about his own involvement, led police to a beach community called High Island, where 6 more recovery sites were identified along the sand. The confirmed total was 27 young men, most of them from the Heights, many of them known to each other, and the process of identifying them involved dental records and personal items found near the remains, because the technology that exists today for that kind of work was not available in 1973. The news moved through the Heights on the evenings of August 8th and 9th, when local stations cut into regular programming to report what was being uncovered at the storage facility, and the shock that spread through the neighborhood was unlike anything it had experienced, because the boys being named were not strangers, but were sons and brothers and classmates and neighbors. And the realization that Dean Call had been responsible while the whole community had trusted him and had him at their tables was almost too large to absorb all at once. Dorothy Hillergeist learned through a media report that remains were being recovered and waited for the call confirming her son David had been one of the first identified after more than 2 years of searching. And Frank Aguirre's mother Josephine, who had been lighting candles every day hoping her son would come home, received the news from a reporter and broke down completely. And the father, who had sat in the police waiting room for 8 months and been turned away every time, had to absorb the fact that both of his sons had been in that storage shed during at least some of those visits. The Houston police chief held a press conference and stated that the victims had essentially been runaways and that their parents bore some responsibility for not keeping closer track of them. And the mayor of the city supported that position publicly. And the response from the families was immediate and furious, because these were boys who had left money on their dressers for upcoming vacations and had never run away before in their lives. And the Vatican's newspaper published an editorial about what had happened, and the Soviet press ran pieces about American indifference, and the case had become international news, while local officials were still trying to explain why they had dismissed every warning they had been given. David Brooks gave his full account to Houston Homicide in a flat and emotionless tone that investigators described as deeply unsettling, going through events chronologically and providing specific details about the handcuff routine and the van, and naming victims that Wayne had not yet mentioned. And he was convicted in March of 1975 and sentenced to life in prison, showing no expression while his wife wept in the gallery behind him. David Brooks died in prison in May of 2020, having served 45 years. Wayne Henley's trial was relocated to San Antonio because finding an impartial jury in Houston was considered impossible, and after a proceeding that drew sustained media attention, Wayne was convicted and sentenced on July 16th of 1974 to 6 consecutive 99-year terms, and he later won a retrial on a procedural appeal only to be convicted again in 1979 with the identical sentence, and both he and David applied for parole repeatedly over the following decades, which meant that families of the victims were periodically required to submit written statements and attend hearings and relive everything. And some of those families were still going through that process more than 40 years after losing their children. Wayne Henley remains incarcerated as of this recording. The official count of 27 has always been understood as a minimum rather than a complete number by investigators and journalists who spent the most time studying this case, because there are unexplained gaps in the timeline and because approximately 42 boys from the years between 1968 and 1970 fit the profile of Dean's known victims closely enough that investigators flagged them as potential additional cases that may never be formally resolved. The decision to end the excavations just over a week after the first remains were found drew significant criticism because both Wayne and David had indicated there were other locations that had not yet been searched, and some who covered the case believed officials made a deliberate choice to stop digging before the number could climb any higher, and the record for the most victims associated with a single case in American history at that time stood at 25, and Dean Corll had already exceeded it. The family of one victim named Mark Scott spent decades uncertain whether the remains given to them by the medical examiner's office actually belonged to their son, and DNA testing eventually confirmed their suspicion was correct, and that the remains they had received were those of a completely different victim, and Mark's actual remains were believed to be at the High Island beach site until Hurricane Ike passed through Texas in 2008 and destroyed a significant section of that beach, and what was hidden there is believed to have been carried out to sea permanently. At least one of Dean Corll's victims remains unidentified to this day, and forensic work to restore names to those who lost them has been ongoing for years, using advances in DNA technology that were not available in 1973. Dean Corll built a trusted reputation in the Heights, which allowed him to operate unnoticed. Parents saw no reason to worry when boys went with him. He was never questioned, and most information came second-hand from two teenagers dealing with legal trouble, leaving the full extent of his cases unknown. Families like Homer Garcia's visited his grave for decades, while Dorothy Hilligeist was remembered as a grieving yet kind figure. Despite 27 victims, there are no memorials. Many residents don't know Corll's name, and the case faded from memory. The real lesson from Dean Corll is not about one man, but about what happens when a community's warnings are treated as inconveniences rather than evidence. Parents gave police information that could have changed the outcome for multiple boys and were sent home every single time without a single follow-up. And that pattern is not unique to this case or this era. If this story made you think differently about how systems respond when working-class families ask for help, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Understanding where institutions fail is the first step toward demanding that they fail less often. Now, let's move on to the third horrifying serial killer story.
Women in Michigan started disappearing. Some were found outside their own front doors. Some were found in alleys. Some were found in places they passed through every single day. No witnesses, no evidence, no motive anyone could explain. Police had a killer and absolutely nothing to go on. What they did not know yet was that the man responsible had already been evaluated, already been warned about, already been released twice, and he was just getting started. This is the story of Carl Eugene Watts. In the spring of 1980, the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan was frightened, and it had good reason to be. On April 20th, 17-year-old Shirley Small was found outside her home. Early morning, just steps from her own front door. Nothing stolen, no witnesses. On July 13th, 26-year-old Glenda Richmond was found outside her apartment building. Same time of day. Same absence of evidence. Same complete lack of explanation. Then on September 14th, 20-year-old Rebecca Huff, a graduate student at the University of Michigan, was found outside her apartment complex. More than extensive injuries. Still no witnesses. Still nothing physical left behind. 3 women, 3 locations, all in the early morning hours, all within steps of their own front doors. Nothing connecting them except the way it happened and the complete silence left behind afterward. The local newspaper gave the attacker a name: the Sunday Morning Slasher. It was the kind of name that stuck because it was accurate. Police formed a dedicated task force. They worked the cases hard, but there were no prints, no witnesses to the actual events, no motive that pointed anywhere useful. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the city. The only real pattern was that they were women, and they were attacked at the same time of day. The task force was running out of directions to look. Then a detective who had worked a series of assault cases in Kalamazoo back in 1974 made a phone call. He had been following the Ann Arbor cases in the news, and the details were too familiar to ignore. The task force leader, Detective Paul Bunton, picked up the phone and started listening. The name that came up was Carl Eugene Watts. That question, who exactly was Carl Watts, did not have a simple answer. On paper, he looked ordinary. He worked for his stepfather's trucking company. He had been married. He drove a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. He was the kind of person you would pass on the street and forget immediately. But Bunton started pulling the files, and what he found told a very different story. To understand Carl Watts, you have to go back to 1953, to a small town in Texas called Killeen, and to a boy that nobody in the world thought twice about. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7th, 1953. His father was in the military. His mother, Dorothy, was warm and creative, a woman who spent her days teaching children to paint and make things with their hands. When Carl was 2, his parents separated. Dorothy took him north to Inkster, Michigan, a working-class town just outside Detroit. She found work as a high school art teacher and raised Carl and his sister Sharon as best she could. She eventually remarried a mechanic named Norman Caesar, who had 6 children of his own. Together, they added 2 more. That home became 2 adults and 10 children sharing the same space. For a boy already quiet and reserved, that loud and crowded environment pushed him further inward. His sister Sharon described him later as someone who almost never showed what he was feeling. She was clear there was no mistreatment in the home, but she noticed that when Carl finally did let something out, it came all at once, and it was never small. Then, at 8 years old, everything shifted. Carl contracted meningitis, a serious infection that attacks the membrane surrounding the brain and spinal cord. In the early 1960s, it was poorly understood and often fatal. His case was severe. His fever climbed dangerously high, and doctors were genuinely worried about permanent brain damage. He spent weeks isolated in the hospital, going through painful and exhausting procedures. His sister Sharon got the same illness and recovered quickly. Carl did not. When he finally came home, his family noticed immediately. The boy who walked back through that door was not the same one who had left. Quieter, slower, more distant, like something had been dimmed inside him and never came back on. On top of meningitis, doctors also found he had developed polio during the same period. He missed nearly his entire 3rd grade year. When he returned to school, he struggled to focus and could not remember things the way he used to. He eventually had to repeat a grade. School became a constant source of frustration. What nobody knew was what was happening inside his mind at night. He began having recurring dreams where he fought women. Not women as real people, but women as dark forces, something threatening that had to be overcome. He described them to doctors years later as evil spirits. Most children wake from violent nightmares feeling frightened. Carl woke up feeling calm, relieved, better than before he fell asleep. By the time he was 12, those dreams were bleeding into his waking hours. He began following girls around his neighborhood, watching from a distance, tracking routines. He did this quietly for 3 years. Nobody had any idea. On June 25, 1969, 15-year-old Carl was on his paper delivery route when he knocked on the door of a regular customer named Joan Gave. When she opened it, he attacked her without warning. He struck her multiple times and then, just as suddenly, stopped, walked away, and finished his route as though nothing had happened. Joan called police immediately. When officers asked Carl why he had done it, he gave them a short answer. He felt like it. Carl was sent to the Lafayette Clinic Psychiatric Hospital in Detroit for a full evaluation. Doctors found a 15-year-old boy with an IQ of 75, just above the level then classified as intellectual disability. He showed signs of disordered thinking. He told them about the dreams, the women, the calm he felt afterward. One psychiatrist wrote his conclusion plainly. Carl was a young man struggling to control powerful and dangerous impulses toward violence. His behavior controls were seriously compromised. The risk of him acting out again was very high. He was a genuine danger to others. On his 16th birthday, they released him. He was sent home with a recommendation to attend outpatient therapy. Between 1969 and 1974, he went to fewer than 10 sessions. Nobody pushed. Nobody followed up. The warning sat in a file. Carl graduated high school and earned a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. He lasted 3 months. Women on campus reported he had been following and approaching them in frightening ways. The school removed him. That same year, a female student at Lane College was found dead. Many believed Carl was responsible. Not enough evidence to charge him. He returned to Michigan and enrolled at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo in the fall of 1974. On October 25th, a WMU student named Lenore Nazaki answered her door with the safety chain on. The man outside said he was looking for someone named Charles. Being polite, she offered to get paper for a note. The moment she unhooked the chain, he forced his way in and restrained her until she became unresponsive. Then he walked away and left her there. 5 days later, at the same complex, 20-year-old Gloria Steele was found inside her apartment. She was assaulted with a sharp object. Nothing stolen, no other reason. Driven entirely by something internal to him. On November 12th, 23-year-old Diane Williams answered her door to the same man asking for Charles. When she turned to get paper, he forced his way inside. Her phone rang at exactly the right moment. She knocked the receiver off and screamed loud enough that he fled. As he drove away, she caught his car, a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. Police built a lineup. Both Diane and Lenore identified Carl immediately. He served 1 year for the 2 assaults. Gloria Steele's case never led to a conviction. Not enough physical evidence. He was out in 1976. The second warning had been written down and quietly filed away. So when Detective Bunton pulled those files in 1980 and matched them against the Ann Arbor cases, the picture that formed was deeply troubling. This was not a man who had suddenly become dangerous. This was a man who had been dangerous for over a decade, evaluated twice, warned about twice, and released both times. In October of 1980, police in Windsor, Ontario reached out to Michigan. Women across the river in Canada were being attacked in an identical pattern. Carl's vehicle records showed his car had crossed into Windsor multiple times, and that attacks in that city followed those crossings almost every time. Then, on November 15, 1980, 2 officers in Ann Arbor spotted a brown Pontiac moving slowly through a neighborhood street, trailing a female student walking home alone. She noticed and ducked inside a building. Officers pulled the car over. Expired license, outdated plates. The driver was Carl Watts. Inside the car, they found wood-carving tools, and then they found a book with the name Rebecca Huff carved into the cover. Rebecca Huff, the graduate student found outside her building in September with extensive injuries. Carl asked for a lawyer immediately. They could not make a murder charge stick. He was released. Police placed him under full surveillance. They followed him constantly, and what they observed was unsettling. Carl drove hundreds of miles on single nights, circling neighborhoods slowly, watching. The attacks in Michigan stopped completely during those months. He clearly knew he was being watched. In the spring of 1981, he quit his job and left for Texas. Detective Bunton contacted Houston police immediately and sent everything. Carl's full record, photographs, vehicle details, a complete summary of the Michigan cases. He warned them directly that Carl was dangerous and needed to be monitored. Houston in 1981 had the highest murder rate in the entire country. The department was overwhelmed and completely understaffed. The warning landed somewhere in a filing cabinet and sat there untouched. Carl found work as a mechanic and settled into a routine. On weekends, he drove into Houston. In a city already overwhelmed with open cases, nobody was watching him. Between September 1981 and May 1982, the pace of what Carl was doing became extraordinary. A college student whose death was ruled accidental because there were no visible signs of what had actually happened. 2 women on the same evening, both found within steps of their own front doors, within 30 minutes of each other. A woman found near Rice University. Her death initially ruled a suicide, a conclusion Carl later confirmed he had deliberately engineered to mislead investigators and observe what they would do. A woman was later discovered in her own vehicle on the same campus. A woman attacked on the highway while changing a flat tire, left in the scene, and narrowly survived. A teenager who disappeared walking to her very first day at a new job. Her remains remained undiscovered for 5 months. A woman still holding her work shoes when found in her own front yard. A woman whose whereabouts remained unknown until later. Multiple victims in the same week, multiple in the same day, and through all of it, Carl left almost nothing behind. No prints, no witnesses, nothing physical at any scene that pointed to him. On the evening of May 22nd, going into the early hours of May 23rd, 1982, 20-year-old Michelle Madej was walking home when Carl followed her to her building. He came up behind her and attacked her and left her unresponsive. He used her keys to get inside and staged the scene in the bathroom. He told investigators later that he did this so her spirit could not escape. The next morning, he returned to the same complex. 19-year-old Lori Lizer had just come home from work. Carl grabbed her from behind near the staircase. She lost consciousness. He took her keys, walked upstairs, and let himself into her apartment. Inside, he found her 18-year-old roommate, Melinda Aguilar, getting ready for the day. He forced her into the bedroom and told her to stay quiet. Melinda made a decision. She went completely limp and played dead. Carl restrained her and tied her hands. He returned to the bathroom and started filling the tub. In the hallway, he clapped his hands and jumped up and down, visibly excited about what he believed was about to happen. While his attention was on the bathroom, Melinda quietly freed her hands. She got to the sliding glass balcony door, opened it, and jumped from the second floor to the concrete below. She landed hard, got up on pure adrenaline, ran to a neighbor sitting outside, and that neighbor called 911. Officers arrived within minutes. Carl saw the patrol cars from the balcony, ran for the stairs, got past the officers briefly, hit a dead end, and was caught. Prosecutors had Carl clearly responsible for that morning, but for everything else, the full pattern stretching back through Texas and Michigan, they were nearly empty-handed. No prints, no witnesses, no physical evidence connecting him to any of it. They were genuinely afraid that going to trial on the larger charges meant losing, and losing meant he walked away from everything. So they made a deal. If Carl confessed to the unsolved cases and helped locate victims, Texas would grant him full immunity for those acts. He would plead guilty to the May 23rd incident and receive 60 years. Michigan refused to join the agreement, keeping those cases open. The families of the victims were never consulted. The survivors were never asked. When the deal became public, the community was furious, but it was already done. Carl accepted. Over 1 week, he walked investigators through 13 cases calmly and in complete detail. He led them to 3 locations connected to missing person cases. When asked why he targeted women, he said they had evil in their eyes, the same evil from his childhood dreams. He believed he was freeing their spirits. He kept hinting there were more. 40, he said once, then 80, then he stopped giving numbers altogether. Investigators who have studied the geographic patterns and timelines across every city Carl ever lived in believe the real number could exceed 100. On September 3rd, 1982, Carl was sentenced to 60 years. Everyone assumed he would die in prison. They were wrong. In 1989, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed Carl's case and found a procedural error. When Carl had accepted the plea agreement, no one had properly informed him that the bathtub and the water he used during the attack on Lori Lizer legally qualified as a dangerous weapon under Texas law. Because of that gap in the original proceedings, his classification was changed from violent offender to nonviolent offender. In Texas, nonviolent offenders earn time reductions. 3 days removed from their sentence for every day, served without incident. Carl became a model prisoner. He followed every rule. He gave nobody any reason to add time back. The 60-year sentence shrank steadily and quietly, year by year, without anyone paying close attention. By 2002, he had a confirmed release date, May 8, 2006. He would walk out of prison at 52 years old, having served just 24 years after confessing to 13 cases and hinting at far more. He was going to be released. When Carl's release date became public, Michigan prosecutors moved immediately. Texas immunity covered Texas. Michigan was still open. If investigators could connect Carl to even one case in Michigan, the release would stop completely. A task force reopened over 200 unsolved cases from Michigan and Canada. Decades of old files were reviewed. Stored evidence was re-examined. They needed something solid enough to hold up in a modern courtroom. Then, in early 2004, a man named Joseph Foy was watching the evening news when a segment aired about Carl Watts and his upcoming release. He called out to his wife immediately. He recognized that face. He was certain of it. On December 1st, 1979, Joseph had been on his back porch in Ferndale, Michigan, when he looked into the alley and watched a man attack a woman. He saw the arm go up and come down. For one brief moment, the attacker looked up and their eyes met. Joseph reported it that same night and worked with a sketch artist. The case went cold. 25 years passed. Now that account, combined with everything investigators had built, was finally enough. Carl was convicted of the first-degree taking of 36-year-old Helen Dutcher on November 17, 2004. Life sentence, no parole. 2 days later, a second charge followed for the 1974 case of Gloria Steele at Western Michigan University. Convicted again in July 2007, another life sentence, no parole. Months later, in September 2007, Carl Eugene Watts passed away from prostate cancer in Jackson, Michigan. He was 53 years old. Carl never gave investigators the full picture. The true number of people he harmed may never be known, and that uncertainty alone should be uncomfortable. What is known is this: every warning existed, written by doctors, confirmed by a second evaluation, sent across the state lines by a detective who did everything right and ignored every single time. The survivors had no voice. The families got confessions without convictions, and the only thing standing between Carl Watts and a quiet walk to freedom in 2006 was one man who recognized a face on the evening news after 25 years. Carl is not just a story about one person. He is a story about what happens when systems treat warnings as paperwork instead of as people. The real lesson in Carl Watts is not about one man. It is about what happens when clear warnings are written down and then quietly ignored. If this story changed the way you think about how systems handle danger, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The more people understand cases like this one, the harder it becomes for the same mistakes to keep happening.